Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East. Five American soldiers were killed in two separate attacks by armed men in northern and western Baghdad. In Kirkuk, northern Iraq, 7 Iraqis were killed, 5 of whom were security guards, by 2 car bombs in the city. Meanwhile, a video distributed by armed men in the city of Mosul showed 3 kidnapped Iraqi hostages who say they work for the Independent Higher Electoral Commission.
Dozens
of Iraqis, mainly policemen, are killed as a result of the increasing violence in a number of Iraqi cities as the election date nears. In the city of Riyadh, about 60 kilometers from Kirkuk, 3 booby-trapped cars exploded. 2 cars exploded at the same time, one near a security checkpoint by Iraqi police and the other near the police station. The 3rd car exploded on the highway.
The Land Cruiser came from this direction very fast. Before the Land Cruiser, there was an explosion about 100 or 150 meters away. Then the car swerved to the right.
The city of Baquba witnessed clashes between unknown armed men and members of the Iraqi police, which led to the killing of a traffic officer who was standing nearby, and 4 civilians were wounded. In the center of Baquba, fighters attacked the Democratic Kurdistan Party headquarters, led by Masoud al-Barzani, wounding one of the guards.
Around 7:15 a.m., a group of about 4 to 5 armed masked men came. They closed all the roads for 4 or 5 hours. They spread throughout the area, and 2 of them planted an explosive device there.
The schools that are being used as voting centers became targets for the fighters. An explosive device exploded outside of a girls' school and another in front of a boys' school in Baghdad, causing parts of the building to collapse. An American military base in Ramadi, west of Baghdad, came under mortar fire after an arrest campaign was carried out by U.S. forces. The U.S. forces also fired shots at a civilian car, killing 1 Iraqi and wounding 3 others. Also, a booby-trapped car exploded on the road leading to the airport in Baghdad, near a U.S. military convoy, causing minor damage to their vehicles. On the issue of kidnappings, a video was distributed by armed men in the city of Mosul, in northern Iraq, showing 3 Iraqi hostages who were kidnapped because they worked in the Independent Iraqi Higher Electoral Commission. Despite the heightened security measures carried out by U.S. forces in cooperation with Iraqi police and army forces, there was no significant decrease in attacks by those who opposed the elections. The fierceness of the attacks continued to increase day after day. In London, a Human Rights Watch report revealed that since the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime and the transfer of power to Iraqi authorities, Iraqi prisoners were subjected to extreme types of torture and human rights violations. The report said that at least 27 out of 90 prisoners were subjected to beatings and torture. This was not denied by the Iraqi Minister of Human Rights, who held the remnants of Saddam Hussein's regime and what he called 3.5 decades of dictatorship responsible. During the training of Iraqi forces by the U.S. or British forces, among the instructions discussed in the booklets that were distributed to the trainees are the need to deal with prisoners within the framework of respecting human rights and not using violent methods to obtain information. However, in Iraq, what is written is different than what is practiced. To begin with, those in charge of the training had their own impact in this context, including the Abu Ghraib scandal, the killing and wounding of unarmed civilians, and the torturing of citizens in southern Iraq. The Human Rights Watch report made this point, putting the blame on the occupation authorities, accusing them of turning a blind eye to violations committed by Iraqis.
Cases where, in some cases, supervisors expressed their resentment to high-ranking American officers, but they were told to be quiet and not to talk about it.
One of the reasons given by Human Rights Watch for publishing the report only a few days before the elections was the fact that the interim Iraqi government has not fulfilled its vow to respect basic human rights, after it promised international human rights organizations not to repeat the experience of Saddam Hussein's regime in practicing torture against prisoners. The report said that these reckless practices do not only occur on members of the Iraqi resistance, but also on members of the opposition parties to the current government. The report shed light on the continued use of hitting, reckless arrests, and long detentions without judicial review or court proceedings. The Iraqi security forces do not even spare children who have not yet reached adolescence.
The establishment of a new Iraqi government takes more than a change of leadership. The government policy towards human dignity and basic human rights must change.
The detailed report on the methods of torture used compelled the American Human Rights Organization to use strong language in its report, criticizing the occupation authorities and the American administration. The report detailed hitting prisoners with electrical wires and iron sticks, subjection to electric shock and blindfolds, and handcuffing people for a number of days, in addition to keeping prisoners in solitary confinement in tiny cells where they must remain standing, and denying prisoners of food and water. The report also revealed that Iraqi police are accepting bribes in exchange for releasing prisoners and allowing relatives to visit or feed them. The torture led to physical injuries and permanent disabilities.
We learned this over the past year. We gave the Judges' Council and Ministers of Interior and Justice everything relating to the use of force. We requested that they take up the issue and punish all those responsible for these violations.
The organization's report did not investigate alleged torture of prisoners committed by the U.S. and coalition forces.
His Majesty King Abdullah said the political, economic, social, and administrative development is an integrated process that should be dealt with as a whole, not as independent and separated elements. In a televised speech to the nation, the King said in order to enhance the reform process in the country and to ensure wider participation of people, development regions will be established, with each to be administered by a local council to be elected by citizens in their respective regions. Following is His Majesty's speech.
على أهمية أن تبدأ التنمية السياسية من القواعد الشعبية صعودا إلى مراكز صنع القرار وليس العكس، وبناء على ما تقدم وتعزيزا لمسيرتنا الديمقراطية واستكمالا لعملية الإصلاح السياسي والاقتصادي والاجتماعي والإداري.
It was one of the bloodiest days in Iraq in several weeks. 36 U.S. Marines and soldiers were killed today, 31 of them in a helicopter crash carrying U.S. troops. A truck bomb exploded near the offices of the Kurdistan Democratic Party in Sinjar town, close to the Syrian border in northern Iraq, killing at least 15 people and wounding 30. And insurgents killed 10 Iraqis and an American in a string of attacks across the country. Wathiq Awad has more details.
If any words can describe the situation in Iraq 4 days ahead of its first general elections, it is nothing but the worst unsafe atmosphere since invading Iraq. For the U.S. military, today was the deadliest day for its forces since they invaded Iraq 22 months ago. 31 U.S. troops were reported killed in a helicopter crash and 5 more died in insurgent attacks. The chopper ferrying troops crashed in the early hours today near the town of Rutba, but there were no details on the cause of the crash. 13 other U.S. soldiers were wounded in various attacks. The heavy U.S. toll came amid series of bombings and raids that killed 10 Iraqis in a campaign to sabotage next Sunday's landmark election. In a closely coordinated attack, 3 suicide car bombers hit the town of Riyadh, a Sunni Arab area southwest of the northern city of Kirkuk. 2 explosives-laden cars blew up simultaneously close to an Iraqi army post and police station, and the third vehicle detonated minutes later on a nearby highway. 4 Iraqi policemen, 2 Iraqi soldiers, and 3 civilians were killed, and at least 12 people were wounded. Shortly after the blast, the U.S. combat patrol heading to the scene came under small arms fire, and 2 U.S. soldiers were wounded. Meanwhile, insurgents fired mortars on a U.S. military base near the western city of Ramadi. Plumes of black smoke could be seen rising from the U.S. base. After the attacks, U.S. soldiers raided houses in Ramadi, arresting 37 people and opening fire on a civilian car, killing 1 and wounding 3 others. In Baghdad, a second car bomb exploded on Baghdad Airport Road, targeting a U.S. military convoy. U.S. troops sealed off the roads after the blast. Hours earlier, a car bomb exploded on the airport road, wounding 3 U.S. soldiers and damaging 1 vehicle. In Baquba, police said 1 Iraqi policeman was killed and at least 8 people were wounded when gunmen fired on the local offices of 3 parties contesting the January 30 polls. In the northern city of Mosul, militants also seized 3 election workers. The government plans extraordinary security measures, including closing Baghdad airport and land borders over the election period, extending night curfews in cities, and banning cars from roads on election day.
U.S. President George W. Bush urged Iraqis to defy insurgents by voting in Sunday's elections, saying the upcoming contest will be a grand moment in Iraqi history. Bush, in a news conference in Washington, dismissed criticism that his troops are not making any progress in Iraq, saying that the fact that elections are being held proves some major progress. He added that the United States will accomplish its mission in Iraq as soon as possible. Bush emphasized that enough U.S. troops will remain in Iraq as long as they are needed in order to get that mission accomplished.
And just 4 days from now, the people of Iraq will vote in free national elections. Terrorists in that country have declared war against democracy itself, and thereby declared war against the Iraqi people themselves. Yet the elections will go forward. Millions of Iraqi voters will show their bravery, their love of country, and their desire to live in freedom. I urge all people to vote. I urge people to defy these terrorists. These terrorists do not have the best interests of the Iraqi people in mind. They have no positive agenda. They have no clear view of a better future. They're afraid of a free society. I am impressed by the bravery of the Iraqi citizens.
About 20 security police took up positions at the Tufah crossing near a Jewish settlement block that has been one of the bloodiest flashpoints. Palestinian security sources said that Palestinian forces were to complete the redeployment of 2,000 troops throughout South Gaza in the next 24 hours. The decision was made under a deal sealed with Israeli commanders at a meeting held at the edge of a Gaza Jewish settlement. Dozens of settlers at the Neve Dekalin enclave scuffled with Israeli police at the site where Israeli and Palestinian officers met. A settler spokesman said police injured 1 protester who was rushed to a clinic, while police said 5 settlers were detained. Protesters also deflated the tires of 2 Palestinian security vehicles amid shouts of "death to the Arabs" and accused the Israeli army of betraying them.
Israeli warplanes again violated Lebanese airspace. They flew over cities in the south despite repeated UN condemnation. Earlier, the UN Security Council began debating a US-French-British draft resolution calling for the extension of the mandate of UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon for another 6 months, but demanding a review of the current structure and mission of the force before the end of July. The Daily An-Nahar quoted sources in New York as saying the Security Council will vote on Friday on the draft resolution, which does not call for reducing the size of the UN peacekeeping force from its current 2,000 members and does not entail a change in its mission. The U.S. originally wanted the Council to push for the restructuring of UNIFIL and link the draft resolution to Security Council Resolution 1559, which was adopted in September and demands the withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon and disarming Hezbollah, without naming both. But the draft resolution in its current form condemns the latest violence along the so-called Blue Line border, certifying Israel's May 2000 withdrawal from southern Lebanon, which Beirut, backed by Syria, views as incomplete. The draft resolution also expresses concern over breaches to the Blue Line and the continued presence of militias in the region in reference to Hezbollah. It reiterates calls on the Lebanese government to deploy its national forces along Israel's frontier. Diplomatic sources said Paris and Washington decided to delay any modification of UNIFIL's mission until after Lebanese parliamentary elections in May and the key United Nations report on compliance by Beirut and Damascus with Resolution 1559. The draft resolution also points to a complete Israeli pullout from Lebanon, despite Lebanese and Syrian protests. They maintain the occupied Shebaa farms at Lebanese territory, but the UN says they are Syrian and both countries can demarcate that border to determine ownership. They have so far refused. Lebanese Foreign Minister Mahmoud Hammoud had officially protested to Security Council members any modification of UNIFIL's size and mandate. Recommending a 6-month extension of the United Nations Peace Monitoring Force's mandate, Secretary General Kofi Annan earlier said 2 incidents in January decisively shattered a period of relatively calm. He said hostile rhetoric remained the norm and stability continued to be threatened by grave events in reference to 2 bouts of deadly violence along the border. UNIFIL was established in 1978 to confirm Israel's pullout from Lebanon, restore peace and help the Lebanese government restore its authority over the area. Russia and Syria pledged to restore Soviet-era ties, striking an accord on Damascus's debts to Moscow and future military cooperation, despite Israel's apparent success in torpedoing Russian weapon sales to Syria. President Bashar al-Assad, whose visit to Moscow provoked a row between Israel and Russia over reported plans to sell advanced Russian missiles to Syria, signed a declaration with Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on defense ties. In Kremlin talks, Moscow and Damascus said they agreed to pursue traditional cooperation in the military-technical sphere in keeping with their mutual interests and international obligations. The Syrian president, whose country has been branded by the U.S. as sponsor of international terrorism, said it had the right to acquire weapons to protect itself against Israeli air attack. Assad said they are defensive weapons when asked to comment on the reported contract for portable Igla anti-aircraft missiles, now seen in doubt because of Israeli and U.S. pressure. Putin vowed to reinvigorate close ties between Moscow and Damascus, a former Soviet ally that has traditionally been a major purchaser of Russian arms. The Russian president regretted that there had been a long pause, as he put it, since the last visit of a Syrian leader to Moscow, but expressed the hope that they could revive a tradition of friendship and cooperation. In a breakthrough, the 2 sides reached a deal on writing off more than 70% of the $13 billion of Syria's debts, mainly incurred from arms purchases. The Syrian leader arrived in Moscow Monday on a 4-day state visit, overshadowed by furious Israeli protests over a reported contract for Russian missiles that would erode the Jewish state's military edge. Despite official denials, Russian commentators said the sale of Igla missiles and Iskander-E next-generation missiles capable of striking Israel had been in the pipeline, but had been shelved after Israeli and U.S. protests. Moscow, already at odds with Washington over nuclear ties with Iran, says the United States' stance on Syria undermines the Middle East peace process.
The Al-Aqsa Martyrdom Brigades announced a 24-hour ultimatum for Israel to stop the assassinations, pursuing Palestinian activists and incursions, and vowed to respond to any Israeli crime. This comes after 3 of its members were martyred in Qalqiliyah city, north of the West Bank, by undercover Israeli elements who were disguised in Palestinian clothes. Meanwhile, Palestinians and Israelis have reached an agreement today in which Palestinian security forces are to take over their duties in 5 cities in the West Bank, including Qalqilia. International pressure convinced Tel Aviv to lift the ban on Palestinian diplomats. The Palestinian delegation, headed by Saeb Erekat, an Israeli one headed by Vice Glass, met and discussed mainly the future meeting between Abbas and Ariel Sharon. The Israelis said they will stop the assassination of Palestinian fighters and plan to withdraw from 4 cities in the West Bank. In return, the Palestinians submitted their own conditions for the cooling-off period.
Stopping the violence must happen mutually and at the same time. We discussed returning to where things left off on the 28th of September, releasing the political prisoners and resolving the issues of wanted and exiled Palestinians. We also talked about settlement activity and the continuation of the construction of the separation wall.
Erekat submitted a report on the results of the meeting to the Palestinian leadership. The European Union was very supportive to these developments in 2 different meetings that were held between the European envoy with President Abbas and Prime Minister Ahmed Qorea.
The Palestinian Authority showed responsibility and took serious measures that deserve encouragement and support. We are working to secure Palestinian demands to move the peace process forward.
Despite the relief that accompanied these diplomatic contacts, the Palestinians were afraid that Israel would do something wrong, which is just what happened.
All these are ambiguous messages, but we understand them as attempts to push things away from reaching any political agreement in any form for a cooling-off period.
Qorea was referring to the assassination of 4 fighters in Qalqilia and Jenin and the killing of a child in Deir el-Balah. Israel has delayed the deployment of Palestinian forces in the south. The deployment is supposed to take place in the coming hours because the Israelis, who held a security meeting at Gaza crossing point, agreed to allow Palestinian security forces to be deployed. The Israelis promised to open all checkpoints as well. However, this agreement did not stop extremist settlers from attacking Palestinian police. The occupation army, which was supposed to keep the settlers away, was late in arriving to the area. Israel is taking hesitant steps in return for the long-term steps taken by the Palestinians. They are demanding the war to immediately intervene and force Israel to take equitable, mutual, and timely steps. From the Palestinian territories, Abdul Karim Samara, Saudi Arabia Kingdom Television.
The Knesset Security and Foreign Policy Committee discussed the issue of natural growth in the Middle East and the implications of the demographic balance between the Jews and Arabs in the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordanian Sea. Our reporter Eli Nissan provided us with this report.
Does the natural birth growth and the lack of birth control in the Arab world threaten the Jewish state? And does the birth growth among the Palestinians in particular pose a threat on the identity of the State of Israel? Today, the Knesset Security and Foreign Policy Committee listened to a presentation of a study on this topic prepared by Professor Daly Biligola from the Hebrew University. According to the study, 10,300,000 people live between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordanian River. 53% of them are Jewish. The study concludes that the Jewish majority will decrease to 44% in 2050.
The results show that the percentage of the Jewish population is decreasing because the Palestinian population growth is higher. The main reason is the high birth rate.
The next survey, which was prepared by a private American company, showed that the Palestinian population consists of 2,400,000, not 3,800,000 as the Palestinians claim. This proves that the Jewish majority has been established in the area.
We are saying the figures given by the Palestinian Survey Center are made up. They are wrong. We tested this 1 year after the other. When we compared figures provided by the Palestinian Ministry of Health and figures provided by the Palestinian Survey Center, we realized that the figures of the Ministry of Health are much less. They are very close to our figures.
What is the explanation for the discrepancies in the numbers of the Palestinian population?
It is clear that there is a deliberate exaggeration in the number of the Palestinian population, sometimes for political reasons. They exaggerate their birth rates and final counts. We are used to this same phenomena, the phenomena of exaggerating numbers in different contexts as well. For example, numbers were exaggerated in order to receive benefits from the UN Refugee and Workers Agency and things like that.
The head of the Knesset Security and Foreign Policy Committee, Yuval Steinitz, talked about the significance of these studies and their implications.
There is no argument that the demographic problem threatens our ability to survive as a Jewish state. One must take this into consideration when dealing with the territories, including Gaza, which by itself is a demographic burden. Areas with geographic and strategic importance in Samaria and Golan Heights must be dealt with differently. We also must look at the regulations we enforce, which are not necessarily always liberal, but crucial in maintaining the Zionist project. Constraints on immigration and family reunification laws. These laws aim at protecting the identity of the small Jewish state, so it is not eliminated by immigration and demographic needs. Amidst talk of a ceasefire agreement between the Palestinians and the occupation government, Israeli authorities resumed the construction of the apartheid wall north of the West Bank, after stopping for 4 months. The wall is creating a new reality on the ground that is completely contradictory to political rhetoric. In the framework of the continuous Israeli settlement activities, the occupation government decided to resume the construction of the upper side of the apartheid wall around the aerial settlement, the biggest settlement block north of the West Bank. The wall goes as deep as 20 kilometers into Palestinian land, occupied since 1967, to ensure that all the settlements end up under complete Israeli control.
This wall will be the final border between the West Bank and Israel. The objective is to link Ariel settlement with other settlements in the area. The decision to resume the construction of the wall right now is to preempt the upcoming negotiations, whether they are held in a few months or a few years. In effect, Israel is drawing the final borders between the Palestinian and the Hebrew states.
If this project is completed, 10 Palestinian villages will be isolated and walled off on all sides. Their residents will lose much of their land, be isolated, lose their water, source of income, and basic services. Their lives are made difficult, so they are forced to leave.
Sharon is creating more new problems by bulldozing the land. Israel claims it is trying to calm the situation, but in reality it continues to confiscate our land. This land is located near a lake. The Israelis want to make sure that all the water stays in their hands and deny water to Arab areas.
It is worth mentioning that the construction of this part of the wall was stopped 4 years ago, because at the time it created political differences with the American administration. Amidst talk of a ceasefire, the occupation forces have decided to complete the construction of the apartheid wall around aerial settlement, creating a new reality that serves Israeli interests when they resume the negotiations with the Palestinians. Kadel Shaheen, Al-Alam, from Ariel Settlement, Palestine.
The views expressed on Mosaic are not those of Link TV or its sponsors, but of the broadcasters themselves. Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin,